Welcome, everybody. Thank you for being at Words Writers, a program of Southwest Seattle Historical Society. Come on in, sit down, get a drink, put your feet up. We have a good program for you tonight. Welcome, come on in. Thank you for being here. There's 20 people there, Jennifer. Bigger than some classrooms, right?
Yeah, it is. I think one of the nicer things about the Zoom format is right now we're getting bigger crowds. By and large on Zoom, it's just more convenient, I guess.
I hope all of you that are on tonight note that you are looking at the face of our speaker, and we will introduce her momentarily. But she is Dr. Jennifer Sherman from WSU, professor of sociology. I guess everybody here knows what WSU stands for. Have to be careful though.
I don't know, do they? I thought we were sort of unknown on the west side.
Oh, I don't think so. Washington is in your name, and it's a state university, so it's a big deal. Yeah.
We like to think so.
Well, coming from Spokane, then it's a big deal to us too. Yeah. You want to go ahead, Elizabeth, or?
Sure, that sounds like a great time. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us for tonight's Words Writers and Southwest Stories presentation. My name is Elizabeth Rudrud. I'm the Programs and Community Outreach Director for the Southwest Seattle Historical Society, and it's an absolute pleasure to welcome you to tonight's program. And before we begin, we want to acknowledge the Southwest Seattle Historical Society and the Log House Museum are located on the traditional lands of the Coast Salish people, past and present. We are grateful for the First Peoples of this region for stewarding this land throughout generations. The presentation you are about to enjoy is part of Humanities Washington's Speakers Bureau program. Humanities Washington is a nonprofit organization dedicated to sparking conversation and critical thinking, and it provides many other cultural programs to hundreds of thousands of people throughout Washington each year. Thanks to support from the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Washington Secretary of State, the Thomas S. Foley Institute for Public Policy and Public Service at Washington State University, and generous private donors, Humanities Washington Speakers Bureau presenters visit all corners of the state, and they do so in person as well as virtually. And we encourage you to visit their WashingtonHumanities.org to find other events like this one. We'd also like to thank our sponsors, including For Culture, Arts Fund, Seattle Office of Arts and Culture, and all of our other sponsors, which we will share with you through our email communications. And their generosity makes this free experience possible for all of us. If you'd like to know more about Southwest Seattle Historical Society or the Log House Museum, you can always find us at loghousemuseum.org. And before we begin tonight's presentation, just want to remind you that you can use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to submit your questions to our speaker tonight. We will also leave time tonight at the end of our presentation for your Q&A. In the chat box, you will see a link to Jennifer's book. And we encourage you to visit that link and purchase this book. With that, I'd like to welcome Dora Faye Hendricks, the chair of Words Writers and Southwest Stories.
Thank you, Elizabeth. But did you introduce yourself?
I did. Got the chance.
All right, you went through pretty fast, but I want the audience to know that we honor Elizabeth's work, and she's relatively new on the staff. I am the volunteer chair of Words Writers and West Seattle Stories. We're switching that name a little bit but I want to welcome all of you. Again, remind you that Jennifer is here thanks to help from Humanities Washington. And since you registered for this presentation, you already know that her name is Jennifer. She is a doctor, a PhD, a professor of sociology at Washington State University in Pullman, and her qualitative research focuses on poverty and inequality, mainly in the rural Northwest. And if you want, you can ask her later how that happens. I asked her. Some of the information you might not know is that Dr. Sherman earned her PhD at the University of California, and her dissertation was called Wealthier Than Half the Income: Poverty, Morality, and Family in Rural America. She's not from this area, though. She was raised in New England, in Connecticut, I believe she said, but she's been here in the West about 30 years, her adult life. And she has attended, she started at the Parsoney Institute in the University of New Hampshire, Family Research Laboratory there also, program in Women's, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at Washington State University. And as I said, she's now in the Department of Sociology. She is the author of 2 books. The recently published one is the name of her program for us tonight, called Dividing Paradise, Rural Inequality and the Diminishing American Dream, written in 2021. And the 2009 book called Those Who Work, Those Who Don't. I mentioned that title earlier too. She's also co-editor of the 2017 volume of Rural Poverty in the United States. Jennifer currently serves as president-elect of the Rural Sociological Society. And I was laughing with her when I was researching this information to share with you. I looked up her resume and found 19 pages of her curriculum vitae. And so if any of you want that reading or want to know more information about Jennifer, we can provide that, or she can provide that for you. So help me welcome Dr. Sherman. Jennifer, you're on. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth and Dorothy. And I'm just going to take a minute here to set up my PowerPoint. So bear with me as I get this going. All right. Okay. And so one other. Okay. All right. So I think we are ready to roll. You guys can hear me okay, hopefully. I want to first just welcome you and thank you so much for joining me tonight. And I want to thank the Southwest Seattle Historical Society and Humanities Washington and the Foley Institute at Washington State University, all of whom made this possible tonight. I'm really happy and honored to have the chance to share my work with you. I encourage you to use the comments function to add your questions at any point during the talk, although I will wait until the end of the talk to address them. But I'm really looking forward to having some discussion after the talk. Before I begin, I would like to acknowledge that Washington State University's locations statewide are on the homelands of Native peoples who've lived in this region from time immemorial. I myself live and am talking to you tonight from land that is the Aboriginal territory of the Nez Perce and Palouse peoples. I want to acknowledge that Indigenous lands were often taken by coercive and violent acts and the disregard of treaties. And for that, we at WSU extend our deepest apologies and we owe our deepest gratitude to the Native peoples of this region. So the official Humanities Washington title of the talk today, and this is their this is their title really, is Diamonds in the Rough, the Gentrification of Rural Washington. But as Dorothy mentioned, it is based on my recent book, Dividing Paradise, Rural Inequality and the Diminishing American Dream. And I encourage you to check out the book if you'd like to learn more about the issues that I discussed tonight. It is based off the book, but there's only so much I can get through in a 40-minute talk. So there's much that gets left out. But I will jump in if this, I think I will. Let's see. I'm having some issue with my slides here. There we go. All right. Okay, so as you learned about me, I am a sociologist at WSU, and my work mostly focuses on rural communities in the West, including those with historical ties to industries like logging. And for this project, I was really interested in the transition from logging to tourism. So today I'm going to tell you a story that's very much about the changing fortunes of the rural West. So we know the rural West was originally tamed, in quotes, through the efforts of manifest destiny, which was really an ideology that was focused on bringing, again, in quotes, civilization to what was perceived at the time as an endless frontier, but of course was fully inhabited already at the time. But development in the West towards that goal at first included things like small-scale agriculture and mining and logging, later oil drilling and industrial agriculture, and all of these industries really grew into the mid-20th century. Subsequently, deindustrialization, basically the opposite process, occurred, and these and other natural resource-based economies collapsed and declined here in the West as they did throughout the nation. So, in the wake of these types of decline, a lot of rural communities have looked for new forms of economic development, and amenity-driven development has been one of those forms, right? This is just basically development that's based around bringing people into a place to enjoy its natural amenities, right? Commodification of its physical beauty rather than the extraction of land-based resources. And this is a form of development that has really been sold as one of the best options to replace extractive industries in the rural West, particularly in places that are desirable for their outdoor recreation activities or as retirement communities and second home communities as well. And this form of development really tends to focus around tourism, but it can also spur growth in second home ownership and retirement migration. So once a place is really recognized as desirable, it just kind of brings people in to enjoy it. And this form of development has a number of positive impacts in terms of economic growth, but also some undesired side effects, including gentrification and the growth of inequality that I'm going to talk about tonight. So gentrification is a term that you've probably heard. I think it's probably hard to live in and around Seattle and not have heard this term before. And it's a concept that is usually, or at least previously, it was mostly applied to cities, to urban areas. And a sort of quick definition is the process whereby the character of a poor area is changed by wealthier people moving in, improving housing, and attracting new businesses, typically displacing current inhabitants in the process. Gentrification has a number usually of unintended impacts, and these include things like rising housing prices in the region, the changing nature of a community and its businesses, and often the systematic exclusion of both low-income individuals and people of color from what had previously been their own neighborhoods. And this is a process that until recently was pretty uncommon or even unheard of in rural places. But more recently, and especially since the coronavirus pandemic, it is occurring in rural communities as well, where it can similarly displace people and rapidly raise housing prices. So you may have heard about the phenomenon of Zoom towns, right? This is an example of this process as the pandemic made it even easier for urban dwellers to work remotely and relocate to scenic rural communities in the Northwest and across the nation. And if you want to think about examples, you can think of places like Bend, Oregon, or Aspen, Colorado, or Sun Valley, Idaho, all of which were once really small working class communities, but are now quite elite and quite expensive. So in rural communities, that shift from extractive industries to a heavier reliance on amenity development, right? Amenity-based tourism and second home ownership and amenity-based in-migration, it can create social and cultural and economic divides between these well-resourced immigrants, people moving in, and the less advantaged locals who've been there a bit longer. And we find that gentrification can occur as urbanites with higher incomes and wealth purchase land, both driving up the prices and increasing scarcity. And my talk today is going to focus on one rural Washington community that's facing exactly this type of dilemma. So I'm going to now introduce you to the place that I call Paradise Valley. All of the names that I'll give you here tonight are pseudonyms, and that's just to protect the privacy of this place and its people, and particularly the people who talked to me for this research. But it is a real place in Washington State, in the rural part of Washington State. It's a community of about 5,000 mostly white residents, and it is currently quite dependent on tourism, has a lot of amenity migrants and a lot of second home ownership. So at this point, more than half of the local homes are owned by non-year-round residents, like people who just come on the weekends or seasonally, et cetera. And nearly half of all the local employment there is in retail or accommodations and food services. And these, of course, are also industries that are really directly connected to that tourism economy. So the rise of tourism as an industry really began in the 1970s in Paradise Valley as Washington State's logging industry began to collapse. So the area had been dependent on logging, but those declines in the resource-based industries, including logging, but as well as mining and ranching, all of that sort of declined in the 20th century and then was counteracted by the rise in recreation and the tourism industry, which now really dwarf those land-based industries in their share of the local labor market. So basically, as Paradise Valley became known as a recreation destination, it attracted more and more second homeowners and retirement migrants. And then as technology improved and allowed for more remote work and easier communication with family and friends elsewhere, we also began to see a rapid rise in younger migrants who were working age, often bringing families and children, often with the belief that it was just kind of a better or more wholesome environment in which to raise a family. So in my work to learn about places like Paradise Valley, I use what are called qualitative methods, which basically means studying social patterns and the social world by just interacting directly with it, with individuals, and then analyzing the patterns that I find. So for me, this research consists of basically two types of things. One is in-depth interviews with usually individuals or a couple of people at a time that are recorded, but also what's called participant observation, and that term basically refers to learning about the social world by just taking part in it, really becoming a participant in the place or the event you're trying to learn about. So it's taking part in daily life, interacting in a sort of natural environment, and then taking lots and lots of notes on what you observe. And then I analyze those notes just like I analyze the transcripts of the interviews that I do. So a lot of what I'll be presenting today are quotes from the in-depth interviews that I've done, but I will also be drawing heavily from my observations and interactions. So basically, what I did to research Paradise Valley was I moved there full-time for 10 months of this field work from 2014 to 2015, so a while ago now. And over that 10 months, I conducted 84 of these in-depth recorded interviews that were sort of semi-scripted and very open-ended as well. And I also spent that whole time doing active participant observation. And some of this was structured, and that included regular volunteer jobs at a local food bank and a family support center and a public library. I did about 12 hours a week of just regular volunteering at those three places. And then I also volunteered regularly for all sorts of local events and organizations and just kind of anything interesting that was happening. But I also just tried to immerse myself in daily life in all sorts of ways so that, it meant taking part in activities, it meant getting to know people, it meant really, just becoming part of the community as much as possible. And through this research, I really came to learn and discover that Paradise Valley was really made up of two pretty distinct groups of people who didn't interact that much with each other, and they lived really different lives in this same small place. And throughout this talk, I'm going to refer to them by the labels I give them in the book, which is newcomers and old timers. And I just want to acknowledge that these labels are, well, they're oversimplifying in a number of ways. I choose them mostly because those are the terms that are used very frequently in this community, and I like to adopt their understandings as much as possible. And these were the sort of least insulting terms they used to describe one another, so I stuck with these. But what I want you to understand is that while these terms make it sound like this distinction is all about when you move to the place, it's really not. That's oversimplifying. What it's really about is differences in social class that just happen to map onto when somebody moved to this place, because the in-migrants are of a different social class from the people who have lived there longer. So the newcomers, by and large, had moved there more recently, and most of them had spent 20 years or less in the Valley. Some of them had only been there a few years. And they did tend to come with a lot higher education, and they had higher income levels on average and a lot more wealth. And wealth can be many things, but it can be land, cars, homes, as well as money in the bank. These folks tended to be generally politically liberal, and pretty homogeneously so. Most of the newcomers were very liberal. And culturally, they had really specific interests that often brought them to this community. They, often were really interested in outdoor sports and endurance sports, also arts and literature. These were folks who went to concerts, went to the theater, and were in book clubs and things like that. And really contrasted with the group that I call the old timers, the folks who had been there generally longer. So most of them had been in the region for more than 20 years. Many of them had been there their whole lives. Some of them had been there for multiple generations. They tended to have lower education levels, lower incomes, and much less wealth. So they were much less likely to own land, own a home, or have much money in the bank, et cetera. Politically, they were more likely to be conservative. They weren't as homogenous, so there was a lot more variation. A lot of them just weren't politically that interested, but they were more conservative than the newcomers overall. And then interest-wise, they tended to have a more working class background and set of interests. So, they were interested in things like hunting and fishing and horse packing, snowmobiling, things like that. And as I got to know people across Paradise Valley, I uncovered a number of different ways in which the differences that I just described on the previous slide made life a lot easier for the newcomers than it was for the old timers. So in the book, I document the sort of systematic ways in which the community's resources came to really be held by the newcomers while excluding the old timers. And this includes work in the labor market and just kind of who's getting the better jobs, who has more stable employment. I also look at differences in housing and home ownership and just how easy or hard it is to find a place to live in this region. Childcare and work-family balance. So, can you actually find safe places for your kids that allow you to go to work? That differs by, your sort of location within this community. Same with social integration. What kind of social networks do you have? How robust are they? How much support do you have? And that sort of bleeds into the next issue of giving and receiving aid, and also even access to education, right? Who has the best educational access within the same school district? And what I find is that in all of those categories, the newcomers just have a lot of advantages. In today's talk, I'm going to really focus in on just these first two areas, work and the labor market, as well as housing. But you'll see that social integration piece come up, and it plays a pretty important role as well. But really, in each of these areas, newcomers have access to resources that make it easier for them to navigate some of the challenges of living in a remote rural community. And in the book, I also discuss the ways in which these newcomers often fail to see their own privilege and the systematic disadvantages that the old timers face. And this is a phenomenon that I call class blindness. So I define class blindness as the tendency for those with social class privilege to be, blind or unaware of their own advantages and unaware of their impacts on less advantaged populations around them. And I find that this failure to acknowledge these differences and the unequal access to power and to opportunities that those differences create, it really undermines our empathy for one another and our compassion for each other's struggles, and just weakens a community's ability to help those in need. So I'll try to illustrate that, as I go through the talk and point out where I see it occurring. So starting though with work in the labor market, since the decline in the land-based industries and the transition to this mainly tourism-driven economy, Paradise Valley had seen growth in jobs in really just a few sectors, including things like entertainment and recreation. And as I mentioned, retail was a significant employer, as was construction, because somebody has to build the houses for all these people who are moving in. But all of these jobs have in common, they tend to be lower paid and lacking benefits. Many of them are seasonal and mostly non-unionized, and a lot of them are less than full-time. And this really contrasts sharply with the manufacturing and forest products dominance of the past era. Those were jobs that tended to be more stable, often year-round, mostly unionized, and they were living wage jobs. They were jobs that allowed a single earner to support a household just on that one salary. So the result of this shift in just the nature of the labor market has been struggles for pretty much everyone to find decent work that can support families, particularly if you don't have a safety net of personal wealth or family help to fall back on. And for newcomers, this often meant that they took pay cuts and they took jobs that didn't fully utilize their education and training and job experience. They described having to settle for lower salaries or fewer benefits or longer hours than they might have had to elsewhere. And many of them had to take work that paid relatively lower wages, as was the case for Frank Brooks here, who was an entrepreneur. And he told me, certainly I cut my salary in half by moving here, and I turned down a job that was going to pay me a couple $100,000 more than that. That was hard, but we made that decision to move there. And it was similar for Anya Wilburn here, who is a nurse, who told me you have to be willing to accept less pay, to not have full benefits, to work way harder, versus in the city, I could go and get triple the money, double the money at least, and have set call days. It's a totally different work environment in terms of a provider. It's rough out here. But nonetheless, many newcomers used their education, their previous experience, their personal connections, and their cultural competence to help them find jobs that they found meaningful and rewarding in different ways. So Claire Woods told me, everybody who comes here starts a nonprofit. So I started a nonprofit, never tried that before. And that attracted the attention of another nonprofit that was working on forestry and fire prevention, and they wanted me to work for them. So I got a better paying job for them, and that just kept leading to other things, right? So she uses her skill set as a springboard to find really meaningful work. Sean Murphy here took sort of a different tack. He had worked in kind of, higher stress jobs prior to moving to Paradise Valley, but decided once he got there to work as a carpenter. And he said, I've always felt capable enough of doing whatever that I've never had to worry about getting a job. It's like, I'm happy to go do some physical labor thing. I can do construction. I have those tools, and there's construction here. No problem. I can do that. I didn't move here with any sort of plan on what I was going to do. So they found ways to make it work, but, really between their ease in finding work and their abilities often to rely on reserves of wealth, such as savings and often houses that were paid off, this meant that newcomers were often able to live pretty comfortably in Paradise Valley. But at the same time, they frequently couldn't understand people for whom things weren't so easy. So this is Sean again, the carpenter, telling me, people who say they can't find a job, that doesn't ring true to me. Finding a job that pays you enough to, say, buy land or a house, that's a different thing. So there's jobs available. I think there's lots of people in the Valley who choose not to work those low-level jobs and instead choose to rely on assistance. I feel like if you have the initiative and then the human connections, the personal relationships that come with being here for a while, there's never a shortage of work to be done or found or created. But it does take initiative and somebody actually who's willing to bust ass and work hard. And so I feel like there are those opportunities, and sometimes there's a dearth of character as it relates to people willing to do those things. So we see here, real blindness to his own privilege in terms of things like wealth and housing, but also education and social connections, all of which made it a lot easier for Sean to find work, and more importantly, to survive on the low wages that work paid. And, for him, that seasonal layoff was no big deal, whereas for somebody else, that could be really catastrophic. And the story was really different when I talked to the old timers. The old timers almost all struggled to make ends meet in Paradise Valley, and they discussed major problems with the seasonal work and the layoffs and the inability to make ends meet on the low wages that both those seasonal jobs and service work provided. Unlike the newcomers, most of the old timers were not ultimately satisfied with their outcomes in terms of job security or wages or hours or flexibility, or often even the nature of the work itself. And they told pretty different stories. So Pam Rhodes, who was just a service worker, said, "It is way hand to mouth. It is not so good here. I am reluctant to make any changes, even though I feel like I don't earn much more than a basic living wage, and I'm 57. So you know what that's going to look like when you try to retire. I mean, I'll have Social Security, end of story, right? No savings if I keep at this job. But right now I would never dare to change." Mark Tate told me there's many people here that I know that have not just one good job, but they have like 3 or 4 jobs just to make ends meet. The jobs are seasonal and some just don't pay well. And Owen Roberts put it very succinctly. He said, "It is really hard to find jobs here in the Valley, especially full-time jobs year round." So rather than, sort of finding ways to make it work, old timers tended to discuss making really tough choices and often just sacrifices to their own basic needs. So Wes Thompson, who had a pretty good job compared to a lot of people, said, "Yeah, it's tight, but we can survive. Once in a while, we'll have to go without the internet for a month or 2, maybe a couple weeks, but we got rid of a lot of stuff. We don't have satellite TV anymore. We just run local stations. We budget tight. My wife's really good about doing budgets, figuring out what we need to do. We always have enough food to keep us going." But in order to keep enough food in the house, they did rely quite heavily on the local food bank, right? So they were making some really tough choices and sacrifices. Old timers also often found that they lacked the types of skills or local reputations or connections to people with jobs to offer that would really help them to find those better jobs. And often for old timers, their local connections could have the actual opposite effect. So people sometimes remembered mistakes that they had made in high school or mistakes that their families had made and judged them as undesirable employees. So this next quote comes from an unemployed man. Family had really deep roots in the Valley, several generations, but also a pretty tarnished local reputation. And although he was often looking for work, he really struggled to find any job stability there. And he felt that reputation was a big part of his problem. He told me, "Apparently I've gotten a reputation around the Valley. I'm not sure how, as a drug dealer, a troublemaker." I look at him and I'm like, "Really? I'll take a drug test right now. I don't do drugs." It's like my dad was friends with a couple of drug dealers and apparently they connected dots. I'm like, you can connect all the dots you want. It's not going to add up. But these multiple forms of disadvantage meant that old timers were much more likely to struggle to find good jobs in the region, and then they were much more likely to struggle to make ends meet on the seasonal and low wage jobs that they were able to find. And when it came to the housing market, I see, pretty similar pattern, right? Newcomers to be at a major advantage. Most of them were moving there from urban areas like Seattle, where their homes were worth significantly more than property in this rural valley. And this allowed them to purchase, really large and impressive homes with custom detailing and expansive views and large acreage. And for them, housing was really a major concern, and they frequently talked about how great it was and how affordable. So Roger Clark, a retiree, told me, "We inherited some money from my folks, and that helped buy this property, and we bought this piece of land. Plus we sold our home, so 10 acres near Seattle. So all of that accumulated and helped us buy this place and have the money to build this home. So things worked out well for us in that respect." And here's our carpenter, Sean, again, giving us a little bit more of the secret to his success. He said, "I came here with a nest egg, but that was also the culmination of a lot of years of working toward that goal of building my own house, buying property." And so it's like, I worked and I bought and sold a few things, all with the goal of getting to a place where I didn't have to. It's not like I'm retired, I'm nowhere near retired, but I wanted to get to a place where I didn't have to kill myself with a huge mortgage and force myself in that situation to work all the time, right? So it's a lot easier to make it work on that carpenter's salary when his house is paid off. And these types of stories really contrasted with those of the old timers for whom housing was one of the most serious struggles that they faced. And newcomers' failure to understand just how difficult housing was for the old timers was yet another way in which class blindness manifested. But the old timers repeatedly described some of the same problems, including rising home values, making it just prohibitively expensive for people without significant wealth to buy homes in the region. Those rising values also meant increased tax burdens for current homeowners, often hurting people with limited cash flow as they think about things like retirement. People were often unsure how they were going to make that work or whether they'd have to sell and leave. They also talked about rising rents becoming just unaffordable for those who are working service sector and low wage jobs. And by the time the pandemic hit, the average service sector salaries were about equal to monthly rents, meaning that there was no way you could live independently and work some of those low wage jobs. On top of all of that, landlords often had explicit preferences for newcomers who were often more like them, and people without children or pets. So, when I moved there temporarily for the year without my pets or family, no problem. It was easy for somebody like me to get a place to live, and a pretty nice one, but it was nowhere near that easy for most of the people, most of the old timers that I interviewed. The result for them was significant housing stress, a lot of housing insecurity, and actually quite a bit of homelessness. And I talked to a number of people who were unhoused at different times over the year. So this is Pam Rhodes, who we met a little bit earlier, explaining how the old timers experienced people like Sean and Roger. And she told me there's definitely the haves and the have-nots. It is pretty hand to mouth for some segments of the community. And then other folks come in and, bless their hearts, but they have mommy's and daddy's blessings, and then they get things bought for them like homes and tractors and cars. And it's just a really different place than it used to be. And Emmett Farley, who grew up in the Valley, told me it's one of the things that I find, really sad about here is it is so hard for young families to find affordable housing. It really sucks to grow up in an area, and by the time you're old enough and raising your own family, you can't do the same work that your parents did and still get by. Adeline Thompson, who's the wife of Wes, who we met earlier, talking about having to give up cable and internet. She said, I'm always worried about the future. I didn't plan on spending almost 18 years in a single wide trailer. I wanted a house before I was 40. Never happened. And finally, Ryan Boyle, who grew up in the region, said, I feel like I wasn't allowed to inherit my kingdom. Like I grew up here, I paid my dues. I thought everybody at least should get their acre, their house, just your chunk to make it. So as I've discussed, access to resources meant that newcomers and old timers had very different experiences in this same place. And although these big differences existed in the level of sort of real and symbolic resources between the two groups, without knowing each other well, they frequently just didn't understand the nature of one another's struggles. And in particular, I noticed over and over again that the newcomers judged the old timers and often assumed that their struggles were the outcomes of individuals' poor choices or bad behaviors or a lack of moral values or work ethics, rather than that these differences were the systematic, the outcomes of systematic differences in their access to other types of resources. So while old timers spoke at length about their own work ethics and their struggles to survive independently without asking anyone for help, the newcomers tended to describe them instead as lazy and drug addicted and welfare cheats and all sorts of negative stereotypes. So a local business owner told me rural communities can cut slack to some people, that it allows them to be more dysfunctional. And then there's a fringe economy, and I'll just say this, you can drive around and you can see it, small old travel trailers packed behind houses. And those are rental units. People are renting those out to people, and a lot of those people are doing things in exchange for the rent that are not good. Criminal activities of various sorts, whether it's drugs or whatever, prostitution, right? So he's just kind of conflating housing stress with criminal activity in this quote. And they had multiple negative understandings of the old timers. Our nonprofit consultant, Claire, told me, it seems to me that the ones who are born and raised here and stayed here and never left are pretty ignorant. And retiree Peter Williams kind of gave me here like sort of a mismatch of like all stereotypes of the poor in one. He said there are mothers, young obese mothers with their babies that are living on food stamps, good chance the father isn't there anymore. There's domestic violence, unwed mothers, teen pregnancies. That stuff is going to happen to them and then to their kids. And although they tried really hard to counter these kinds of assumptions through both their words and their actions, old-timers were often very aware of those types of judgments, and it left them feeling pretty frustrated and resentful and just excluded and alone. So Irene Nelson, a local artist, told me, you're ending up with this social clash. Unfortunately, I really do see a class war starting to really develop. Before, nobody had a huge amount, but it was still within this broad band. Now you're seeing some folks up here and they are very disdainful to everybody else. And Martha Crawford, who'd lived in the Valley her whole life, told me the community isn't the same as it used to be. Now it's all the people that moved from Seattle or Colorado, California, and it is a beautiful area to come and live in. I'll grant them that. But I wish they would just think a time or two about the people that lived here for so many years, kept things going. I like people, and I usually say good morning or hello or how are you or something. And I've had looks that looked at me like, oh, I don't know you. You know, and I heard so much about this, the people feeling really disrespected when, you know, people didn't wave at them on the street and they just felt, again, kind of excluded in their own community. And that sense of exclusion was noted even by old-timers who really tried to reach out to the newcomer community, but they often were left feeling kind of snubbed. So Megan Wig told me about trying to go to church and said, when I used to go to church with a friend outside of the Valley, I felt very supported, like they wanted to save me and they wanted to help me and they would help me anyway. And then when I went with my recent friend here, I don't know if it was just the church or the people that go to the church, but I felt more like pushed away, like I wasn't somebody they wanted in their church. I just kind of felt awkward there, like I wasn't one of them. And Allison Lloyd, another stay-at-home mom, told me about her experience trying to get involved with the PTA and deciding that it just wasn't for her. And she said, you know, so everybody has, in a small town, everybody has their own views of you. I really don't care what people think of me, but I guess it does hinder me from doing stuff though too, that I don't want to, I guess it's easier to just, I can know what they think about me all day long, but having to go deal with it is another thing, right? So she just ended up giving up because she just felt kind of judged. So in the end, Paradise Valley was this really divided community in which these two groups had very little in common, and they didn't interact a lot nor understand each other's experiences. And this meant that one group was able to systematically amass the bulk of the community's resources amongst themselves while simultaneously blaming the other group for its lack of resources. And I argue that this failure to see and respond to social class inequality has multiple negative impacts on a rural community like Paradise Valley. So in the book, I really dig into and explore this self-perpetuation of inequality as this one group dominates the community's best jobs and housing, and they also have more access to reliable childcare, better educational access, has more social support and more power within the community. And the other group becomes increasingly disempowered and marginalized within what was their own home. And it results in, kind of exclusion and dehumanization from one side and frustration and anger from the other. And in the book, I also discuss this sort of larger increasing divide in understanding and worldviews between these two groups, finding that they don't really understand or relate to each other at all, and they prefer not to interact with each other, thus undermining the social cohesion that has long been associated with rural communities. So in the book, discuss that decrease in social cohesion and concern for fellow residents on the other side of the social divide. I found that even people who really wanted to help the less fortunate often wanted to do it in this sort of impersonal way where they didn't want to interact directly with individuals. They would much rather give a donation to a local charity and let that middleman deal with the poor, hands-on. They didn't actually want to get to know their neighbors in that way. In the book, I also look into the political and cultural divisions that are, they were sort of boiling up at that point. This was pre-Trump administration when I was doing this research, but they were already some really major political and cultural divisions and just kind of a failure to see the world in similar ways at all, right? And this social divide, it undermines people's abilities to care about and directly help each other, but it does then also bleed into these other realms, things like politics, where the residents of this community, just as in other gentrified rural communities, but really as in the US more generally, have become increasingly divided and just unable to relate to each other at all. So I'd like to end on like a slightly positive note, because I know this is kind of a dark talk, but I argue that healing social divides, both in a place like Paradise Valley and in our larger nation, requires a combination of micro and macro level efforts to support and sustain healthy families and healthy relationships between residents. And I think it's really important to think on multiple levels when we think about how can we address some of these issues, because, as I like to tell my students, you can't fix social problems on an individual level, right? You have to address social problems on a social level as well, or else it's not going to work. So I want us to think kind of macro and micro, and starting with that big scale, we really do need to think about how do we support all families and all adults. And, we could think about federal as well as state level policies that could possibly even the playing field and decrease inequality, right? Give everybody a little bit more of an equal starting point and an equal chance to make it through work. And so that might look like policies that create real living wage jobs. We might want to think about, why doesn't work pay a little bit better? Why did we in 2020 deem a whole bunch of jobs essential to our economy, and yet those are the same ones that don't pay a living wage, right? Where people can't afford housing and they can't afford childcare or any of these things. We might want to look at it that way and think about how do we change the nature of our labor market. Or we might want to think about it another way and think about how do we support those other necessary aspects of life, right? Healthcare, childcare, housing support, those kinds of things that would allow people to both work and actually survive and raise families as well. So we really do need to, do that work on the large scale. Then on the community level, I think every community has its inequalities and its divides, and each community does have to grapple with how do you address needs in your community. And one of my insights from this work, and particularly that participant observation I did at a couple of local service organizations, is I noticed that charitable and aid efforts that really work to build connections between more and less advantaged residents can really help build trust and understanding and empathy. So, it's really the difference between, are you handing somebody a bag of food and then kind of shooing them out the door, or are you taking the time to get to know them, get to know what they're doing here, what's going on in their lives, what do they like to eat, those kinds of things, really getting to know them a little bit, treating them like a person, not just a person in need. Those efforts not only can create those connections that were otherwise lacking, but they can make people feel really valued and more willing to reach out when they are in need of help. And then finally, at the individual level, in our daily lives, what can we do? And I think, we can start by sort of checking our assumptions about other groups of people, right? Just getting to know people before you judge another person. So I think about, how do we humanize our daily encounters and just reach out to people that we might interact with through social institutions, right? Our schools, our churches, our kids' sports events. In each one of those little micro interactions, you have the opportunity to either resist or give in to the instinct to kind of, gravitate towards the people who are most similar to each of us versus reaching out to the ones who are least like us. And I'm very lucky that I get to do work like this where I really do get to know people who are much less like me. But, for each of us, I think it can help to significantly improve and enrich our own lives and the lives of others in our communities. So I'm going to end there and open it up for Q&A. And I just want to thank you for taking the time tonight.
Jennifer, thank you very much. And already you're getting some comments and appreciation for your comments. The question and answer format didn't work out so well, but the chat did. So in the chat, what did I just now do? Are you reading them, or would you like me to read them to you?
I'll let you read them, and it's okay. A little distracting if I try to answer them and read them at the same time. Of course.
Now, why can't I pull up that chat? Anyhow, great and thought-provoking presentation. Added, yes. And some of the questions. Why did the newcomers move there? Just for an easier lifestyle? It seems to be the remote work movement. Would you speculate that the divisions have become worse?
That's a lot of questions. So I'll try to break it down into smaller pieces. The why was complicated, and there were a number of real draws to this community. A lot of people moved there just because it's beautiful and because of the outdoor opportunity. So a lot of people talked about just wanting to be closer to nature, wanting the opportunity to go hiking or those kinds of activities just closer to home and not having to drive hours to be someplace really pretty like that. Some people really did want to kind of unplug a little bit, and raise their kids in what they thought of as, they would tell me stories like, oh, here my kid doesn't need a cell phone as early, or that kind of stuff. They just wanted a simpler lifestyle. But yeah, it was a lot of that kind of thing, but some combination. And they often chose this community, particularly because there were already other people like them. So it's sort of a self-sustaining process. Once they would tell me, well, other parts of Eastern Washington are really conservative, but this community is more liberal. So it kind of reproduces itself that way. And the second part of the question, can you reread that?
Would you speculate that the divisions have become worse? Yeah.
It's hard for me to say. I still go back a lot. And I don't know that I think the social division has necessarily gotten worse. The economic division has. So since the pandemic, the poor are poorer and the rich are much richer in this community and probably in lots of places. So certainly there's a lot more hardship than there used to be, but I think I will also say that a lot of these local organizations have really taken on this social issue a little bit more seriously, particularly since they found themselves the subject of a book. And it's helped them, really think about, okay, how can we address this and some of the real problems, right? So they've taken on some of these major issues like housing a little bit more hands-on. So I think there's a real effort on the ground to be a bit more mindful about the way in which they kind of create community in this space, but it's still a real challenge, particularly as, wealthier and wealthier people are buying bigger and bigger plots of this region.
Good point. Zach Mohammed says, thanks for the informative lecture. I'm looking forward to checking out your book. I was wondering how old-timers' recent experiences have impacted their political identity. Have the old timers been historically conservative, or has there been a shift in recent years?
Yeah, I wasn't there historically, so I can only really talk to what they told me, but it did seem like people got a bit politicized, really starting with the Obama era. And in the book, I get into this a little bit, the ways in which the discourse of the Obama period overlapped with a lot of their experiences were really telling. So, part of the right-wing rhetoric of that time was very anti-government, right? That was all about smaller government or get the government out of, this or that. And that really resonated with a lot of people who felt like they'd been disenfranchised by government agencies. Because you have to remember, this is, a rural area where a lot of the land is publicly owned, but the management of that public land had changed a lot as the nature of this region changed. So, the regulations start to change, water use, ranch land, all of that starts to change as there's greater demands from more people, and things become more restricted. And so people were angry, and that kind of anti-government rhetoric totally made sense to them, right? It was easy to blame this kind of like faceless behemoth that you could imagine was doing this to you, even though it wasn't, it wasn't like it was personal, of course, but there were, increasing restrictions on how you could use water, which had, real impacts on local people, or how you could graze cattle had real impacts. When public land is no longer available for that, it could really mean, the difference between success and failure for some of these folks. So that really played into their politicization over time.
Very good, with good insight too. Kim writes, wonderful presentation, Dr. Sherman. This is about rural U.S., not just Washington State. There are several rural communities throughout the U.S. who are losing their local hospitals, and some are losing other related healthcare access. What are your thoughts on how these communities and individuals can be supported from a sociology perspective on what can be done to, support these communities?
I think that's a really great point. And healthcare is such a crisis level in this community and all over rural America. And it's a really, really tough one. Certainly without better and more universal access to healthcare, it's really hard to keep rural providers because, they don't get paid what they get paid in urban areas. And so we've got a crisis in, kind of actual physical healthcare, also mental healthcare, all for these same reasons, where it's hard to bring people into places if they don't know it, especially more remote places, and it's really hard to keep them there when they can go make twice as much somewhere else. And it's hard to make it pencil out for a hospital or a provider when most of the patients you're seeing, can't pay the bills, don't have good enough healthcare, and you're always running at a deficit. So I think that's one of those where it would really take that kind of macro level intervention into the way we provide things like healthcare. But, I think that could translate into a lot of other parts of the system. You can think of that in terms of education. We have a similar problem. In terms of transportation, we have a massive problem in rural America. I am more recently doing work on rural jail incarceration, and we have the same kind of problem in our criminal justice system in rural areas. So in all of these ways, we really need to think about our can we share some of the wealth from the rest of the nation or the rest of your state, or is there some way to more equitably distribute resources so that we can afford to keep basic services running in these rural communities, because otherwise you just can't. Good
thoughts. I would make a comment myself. When I was a young woman, we moved from a city area. It was Spokane. It wasn't like Seattle. Moved to a more rural area in Vermont, and our husbands worked together. They were right out of college, and they were not appreciated by the old timers. They were planners, regional planners, but they had a welcome committee, and it was a social thing where the women welcomed us women. But as you talk about all these issues, I think that would be a good way for the welcoming committee, newcomers club, or whatever they called it, to help the newcomers see that we want you to know us. We want you to accept our way of living and what we're used to, and understand each other. And maybe they could help that communication. I don't know.
Yeah, no, I think it's one of the, the issues that I found there was it was a very active community. There was a lot of really fun events and things going on, but they weren't super inclusive a lot of the time. And they did tend to kind of self-segregate by interest, but because the newcomers had so many more resources, they threw all the really cool events, and they were expensive or they were exclusionary, and there wasn't a lot that was, really brought all of the community together. So thinking about ways like that to reach across that divide and include everybody in the same event that was one of the suggestions I gave to some of the local nonprofits when I left was, you throw some great parties, but maybe find ways to, make them available to the folks who lived here longer as well.
We need to do that across the board. Murti, I'm sorry if I messed up the pronunciation of your name. Says to you, Jennifer, this was really interesting. I would love to read more about this, and I'm wondering whether you're planning to write maybe a series of articles for maybe something like the Seattle Times, for instance, to share these interesting reflections with people who might not have access to the book.
Well, I haven't been invited to write for the Seattle Times, but I have done a bit of, kind of radio interviews and things like that at the time that the book was first released. And I've spoken with a few reporters, and there were some stories. I'm trying to remember, like Wenatchee World or something like that. There was a reporter who did a whole series on this talk and the book, and did some interviews with me as well as some folks on the ground. So I've done a little bit of that sort of thing, but mostly I just respond when I'm invited. So if you know somebody, tell them to reach out to me.
Well, the Seattle Times welcomes opinions and guest editorials. So pursue that. Judy Bentley asks, what institutions help overcome the divide? Schools, churches?
Not so much, at least not at the time that I was working there. I think both of those, particularly the school system has really done some thinking about this since I was there. I did find that the school was really an agent of reproducing inequality more than leveling it, unfortunately. And I've written articles on that, and there's a little bit about it in the book as well. But yeah, that was definitely one of the ways in which this divide really was worsening, was through the schools. There was one organization that I thought did an amazing job that I worked very closely with while I was there, and they were sort of an umbrella organization that ran a number of different aid organizations around the valley, but they also ran the food bank where I volunteered, and I thought they did a really lovely job of trying to meet a whole bunch of different needs, but always with this attitude of like, we're here to build connections, where and they were the ones where you didn't just go get food. Like, you sat down with an individual who talked to you at length about who you were, what you needed, and then they would walk you individually around the food bank, introduce you to every volunteer and say, this is Jen, she's a vegetarian, she's looking to get this and this way, she doesn't like potatoes, but she does like onions, she has, and really actually made those connections. And so then when you saw that person the next time, or you saw them in the grocery store, you could say, oh, hey, they really were all about finding different ways to just make personal connections and make every individual feel valued. And I think they did a great job. But some of the other social institutions were lagging a little, and hopefully have been working on it since I left.
Zach asks, are town officials satisfied with recent changes? Sounds like there's been a lot of economic growth, even though quality of life has fallen for old timers.
Are they satisfied? Well, most of the leaders right now are newcomers, so they're pretty satisfied.
Part of the problem.
They've really taken over the local governance to a large degree because they have more power, they have more resources, they have more education, they have more confidence, and they're not struggling to survive in the same way, right? When you're just trying to get by, it's a lot harder to find that extra time for the stuff like leadership.
Sure. Sandy says she has no question, just thank you for a very interesting talk.
Oh, thank you.
And someone writes in anonymously, what did you learn about reasons people do or do not learn new skills to help them prosper in our current economy? For example, learning computer skills and so forth. Of course, we have that problem here in the Seattle area too, in the outskirts, the smaller towns have older people in them, old timers too.
I think, there's a few barriers, one of which is just access to education and training. So in rural communities, you just don't have that, right? You have to go somewhere else to access higher education or higher levels of training. And a lot of old timers just, they don't know any other place. They don't have any, they don't have any connections elsewhere. It's just really hard to make those kinds of transitions. And then it's not really clear that it would translate for them directly into a job because those opportunities don't really exist, right? So we have sort of the opposite problem where people with those kinds of skills are working as carpenters because that's all there is. And that was a really common thing, that folks like Sean, the well-educated carpenter, was super common in this community because of that. And I think there was also, honestly, I don't think this is one of the findings, was that there was a bias against old timers in the labor market. So, I asked it a few times when I would hear from local business owners, like, oh, there's nobody in the Valley that has the skill to do this thing. Nobody knows how to run whatever it is they're doing. I would ask questions like, well, have you thought about like setting up an internship for high school kids to learn that skill? And they would just kind of, like blow that off and say, well, these kids don't want to work. Like, we need people from outside. We need newcomers to come in and take the, who already have those skills. And they just had a real bias against the local kids. And again, like, imagine that they were all troubled in some way and that anyone who stayed there had a problem. But I will also say that that is one of the changes they've made since I left, was that they've instituted a program to train local high school kids in some trades, which I think will help some of them.
You've got some really good ideas, and I'm glad that you were able to talk about those things and present it in your book, because that's a challenge to keep old timers busy and or employed all over the United States. There are a lot of people getting older, and with this influx of new, better educated people, the problem is going to continue to blossom until people do what you're suggesting. So thank you again very much. I think we've gone through the question and answers, unless I don't see any new one coming in. So thank you very much, Jennifer. It was a delight to see you and to hear you. Did you want to say something to people about how to access your book? Obviously, local bookstores.
Yeah, I think there's a link in the chat that Elizabeth put there to the publisher's website. You can also just get it on like Amazon or through your local independent bookseller. But yeah, I just want to say thank you all so much for coming tonight. And I really appreciated your questions and feedback. And Dorothy, I'm so glad we made this happen.
Well, I can't do it without people like you. A couple more thank yous here. Somebody says, "Go Cougs." That was that. And Catherine says, "Thank you, Dr. Sherman. Very interesting topics. Thank you for an informative presentation."
Well,
You're a delight. Thank you.
Take care.
We'll watch for your name on more books in the future. Okay.
All right. I'll let you know when my
right.
next talk is out.
All right. It's after 7. So without any more questions, we'll say goodnight. And I thank all the listeners that are here, and thanks for the participation. The look on Jennifer's face tells you how important your participation is to our speakers. And you are very important to us, or we wouldn't have those kind of comments either, Jennifer. So, yeah. Thank you, and good night, everybody.
Good night.